Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He's like a tree planted by streams of water, that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither, and all that he does he prospers. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. This psalm is an interesting one in that it is a wisdom psalm. It sets out to tell us something about how the world is, rather than being a straightforward prayer. It isn't designed primarily around praise or petition, wherein we ask God to do particular things. It's here to teach us about the world and how to live in it. All the psalms do this implicitly, in the midst of doing other things, but Psalm 1 does it explicitly. Fascinating, too, that this is the psalm chosen to open this entire book of songs. It sets out a paradigm for what this collection of songs is for, namely, to delight in and to meditate on the law of God. The Psalms are the means by which the people of God set their minds on God's words, applied in a myriad of ways. When we come to other Psalms, we find ourselves learning how to speak in the presence of God. But Psalm 1 establishes the world in which that sort of prayer or song takes place, which is an important point in and of itself. This isn't describing some idealized world or some Christianized version of the world we should seek to live in. Rather, it is describing the world everybody lives in, whether they believe it or not. When the psalmist opens by declaring a blessing on a man who does certain things and doesn't do other things, he isn't wishing for that blessing, but simply stating a fact about the world that God has made. This is the blessed man. This is what a blessed man does and doesn't do. We tend to live in a world where we pretend to be little gods, deciding what sort of world we live in for ourselves, and describing the sorts of blessings we want and don't want. But the wisdom of the Bible is to describe the world as it actually exists. You can either conform to that wisdom or you can rebel against that wisdom, but we don't get to change how the world actually is. Now notice the progression set out in the first section of this psalm. The blessed man doesn't walk, stand, or sit with the ungodly. This psalm begins by establishing an antithesis in the behavior of the one who is blessed and the life of those who disregard or scoff at the law of God. This flies in the face of how we moderns tend to view the world. Christianity is not something that we add to as an addendum to how we live. Say we accept in general how secular culture sees the world, simply tacking on a bit about grace and sexuality and maybe kindness. The law of God, though, speaks to all of life and is a claim to all aspects of our life in the world. Here in this psalm is a loyalty to God and His Word that sets us apart from what is accepted as normal ways of living by the world. What is the way of your living is the question the psalm addresses. It is speaking in a very general way about every single part of our lives, not merely some religious part of life, but every single part of it. Marriage, children, work, worship, other relationships, politics, leadership. There isn't any part of life outside the scope of what Psalm 1 is about. It's also important for us to see that it only offers us two options. There is the wicked and the godly. There's no neutral ways of being in the world. Now, we don't like this. In every area of life, there is a way that accords with godliness, and there's a way that is wicked or ungodly. There is a way that will lead to life and flourishing and fruitfulness in its season, and there's a way that leads to perishing and being blown away like chaff. One more observation before we look at the key distinction in the psalm. The way the psalmist uses the language of knowing and judgment in verses 5 and 6. God knows the way of the righteous. This isn't merely a kind of cognitive awareness. This is covenantal language. The righteous ones belong to God. He keeps them. He protects them. He loves them. The alternative to this knowing is to perish, to face destruction. The contrast is between those who will be unable to stand before God the Judge and those who not only can stand before God the Judge, but are also known by Him. They're His. So what marks these two very different sorts of lives? The unblessed man, or the wicked man, is the one who lives according to the counsel or the wisdom of the ungodly. He's the one who lives in the way of those who have rejected God's law, who do not do what God says and do not believe what God says and do not recognize God's authority. The blessed man is the one who meditates on the law of God, who delights in the law of God. One learns how to understand life and wisdom and marriage and sex and politics and money and friendships. They learn how to do this from those who disregard what God has said to us in his book. The other learns these things from God himself through that same book. One will know only fruitless destruction and judgment. The other will know life and fruitfulness and will be known by God. The most obvious thing this psalm leads us to do is to meditate on God's words, to learn to love and trust and obey God's words. But we must do so as those who are seeking to see everything in our lives and in the world through the lens of God's law. There is no arena where what God teaches us there is not relevant. It offers us wisdom in all of life, in our business dealings, in civic issues, in social issues, and in our worship among God's people. Beware of anyone, particularly church leaders and theologians, who are remarkably good at this, who tell you that God's law is not applicable here, or this scripture has nothing to say to us about this particular situation. Don't let any part of your life be siloed from the instruction of God. You should seek the Lord's counsel from his word in every difficulty, in every relationship, in every business deal. Parents, don't let any part of your children's lives be siloed from the instruction of God. Their education should be saturated with God's law. Your home should be rooted in God's book. So may your life be planted by this stream of water and bear the fruit that such a life is promised to bear. Next week we'll consider Psalm 2. But for the remainder of this week, I want to encourage you to read this psalm, Psalm 1, again and again and again, to pray this psalm, to memorize this psalm.